Welcome to the channel. This is my boy Gabe, and I'm going to tell you guys why not to get a rough country lift. So a rough country lift, as you guys may know, is a cheap lift that you could achieve a 3-inch lift, and they're relatively easily to install. And really what a rough country lift is that usually they give you a little spacer that you put on top of a shock on the front for an independent front suspension. And from my experience of a rough country lift on this 3rd gen 4Runner was you put that on there and all it does is messes up the whole geometry of the vehicle. It pushes everything down instead of like giving you a proper lift like what I have now. All it's really doing is just pushing everything down, and it's just really a spacer. And what happens is that the geometries of the ball joints, instead of being here, they become like this, and it becomes extreme. And so what happens is that the angles go off, and so you're now having ball joint issues, upper ball joint issues, and you really don't want to have those kind of issues because they're pretty major components. And that's why I'm saying I would not go with a rough country lift. And there are situations where I understand why you would get one. Let's say it's just like some trail rig that you need some extra clearance. For example, the first rough country lift I bought was for an 83 Toyota pickup, and that came with leaf springs, some blocks in the back, and all the shocks. And from my experiences, it was rough, but it was just a cheap trail rig that I needed some extra clearance on it. And I actually think like for the 1st gen it was cool because it came with leaf springs, but when you're dealing with independent front suspension, you see that the cheap rough country is literally just that block. So if you have independent front suspension, I just don't recommend getting rough country, because you're really going to be spending more money when you realize that, oh, you know what, I should have just went all out and got the good suspension. So I think that rough country lifts are really a waste of money, unless, like I said, it's some kind of trail rig. And from my experience also, like by having that spacer in there, you're actually like wearing out all your bushings, because you're forcing all that, you're forcing everything down, instead of like having the shock do all the work. Now it's doing some more work because it has this spacer on it, and everything's now maxed out. Those bushings, like instead of it being in the center, like the shock bolt, it starts getting moved up, and eventually you're busting out those bushings. So like I said, I think rough country lifts, if you need a quick lift for a trail rig, good idea. But if you have some long-term daily vehicle, I really don't recommend it, because in the end you're gonna be spending more money on repairs, and eventually you get a new suspension. And if you're wondering, like, what's the difference then between that spacer and having an actual good suspension? Well, the difference is having that spacer, yeah, it's just like a spacer, and it just forces everything down, compared to a real like lift. Like for example, this has some built-in shocks. The reason it's lifted is because you have some stiffer shocks and some stiffer springs in there, and that's literally why it gets lifted, instead of like just being the spacer that's just creating more work on everything else on the suspension. When you get a good lift, all that work goes into the shocks and springs that you put on the vehicle. The reason why this is lifted is because it has some stiffer springs with some stiffer shocks, and that's why I achieved this lift. And by stiffer, I don't mean that it's gonna be rough like a rough country lift. It's just that all the work is gonna be done by the shocks and the springs, compared to having that block on top of the shock and springs that's really just creating more work for everything else on the suspension. Okay, a little explanation on this whole thing. So on the left we have the stock length of the shock, and on the right we have the rough country spacer lift. And what happens is that the rough country spacer lift actually makes the whole assembly of the shock about 1.5 inches longer, and it's forcing the whole assembly down. And what eventually happens is that a response from the bushings is they're going to go from the stock position right here, right in the center, and it's going to move up because the shock is being forced down. So then that bushing is reacting as the body forces that bolt up. And so let's look at the suspension geometry after we see that the bushings are going to get ruined. We see the suspension geometry, right? We have on the left side the stock geometry, and we see that the ball joints are pretty in line, right? You have this perfect cross almost. Of course, it's not perfect in motion, but when sitting, it is a cross. But if you look at the rough country geometry of the ball joints, the green is where the ball joints are located. We have a different geometry. We see that there is now an angle here, a much different angle compared to a closer to 90-degree. And on the bottom ball joint is the same story. We have now more of an angle. And so looking at the ball joints, we observe that on the stock setup, the forces and the reaction forces are linearly going up and down. So let's say there's an impact on the ball joint and it goes up. Well, the reaction of the ball joint is going to go linearly down. So it's going to be in this, let's just say a Y plane for now. So it's just going to go up and down. Up and down. Every time there's a speed bump, it's going to go up and down. But let's look at the rough country. Since we did see that now there's an angle, instead of the ball joint reacting, going up and down, now the ball joint is reacting up. When there's a force up, now the ball joint is reacting down to the left. But also, let's see, when there is a force going down on the ball joint, it's going to react to the top right. We can see these are now all new motions of the ball joint. Is going to wear all these ball joints using the rough country lift because it's reacting in so many different directions compared to the stock setup that's only reacting in up and down, or maybe a slight angle, but nothing as extreme as the rough country. And if you guys are interested in what lift I'm running on the 3rd gen 4Runner, I'm actually running some Bilstein 5100s, running on some 99 talls on the 3rd perch for anyone who's interested. And I actually have these Freedom Off-Road upper control arms too. Gives you some more travel, goes up and down a lot more. Before, it was actually maxing out and causing the angle of this to be more extreme, and this actually makes it more linear instead of having like some kind of angle because of the old upper control arm. The back, I'm still running my rough country coils, but I do have different kind of shocks. And yeah, so I say just go all out, get the good suspension, because you're gonna end up spending more money trying to correct the mistake you made of buying a rough country lift.